Hello everyone, today we are going to talk about the linguistic imperialism. Let's start with the definition of the linguistic imperialism. According to Philipson, it means international domination of a language. The researchers who are interested in this subject try to answer the question why and how certain languages start to dominate. While speaking of the linguistic imperialism, it is important to know how the languages spread. One of the examples could be a combination of military, commercial, and Christian missionary activities during the global European dominance. People traveled and most of the times forced others to speak their language. Just as other languages spread a few hundred years ago, the same happened with English. It's widely known that English is considered to be a lingua franca. It has become the language that is spoken in the whole world and is used by millions of people, most of which are not even native speakers. As it has many advantages such as easier communication, getting to know other cultures, new business opportunities, and so on, it also has many disadvantages that could harm people who don't speak the dominant language. Therefore, what are the consequences of English becoming an imperial language? It can cause exploitation, injustice, inequality, and hierarchy that privileges those able to use the dominant language. Also, it is structural. Therefore, more material resources are related to the dominant language than to others. Another consequence is that beliefs, attitudes, and imagery put the dominant language on the pedestal, stigmatize others, and rationalize the linguistic hierarchy. Also, the dominance is hegemonic, which means that it is internalized and naturalized as being normal. And since it's being hegemonic, it means that the rights for speakers of different languages could be unequal. Language use is often subtractive. It means that proficiency in the imperial language is at the expense of other languages. And at last, it's a form of linguicism, a favoring of one language over others, in ways that also promote societal structuring through racism, sexism, and class. It privileges users of the standard forms of the dominant language.
How might the teaching of English be considered an aspect of linguistic imperialism? To answer this question, we will have a look at the natural, neutral, and beneficial spread of English from Alistair Pennycook's book entitled The Culture Politics of English as an International Language, which he wrote in 2017. Okay, well, let's put this discussion into context. Despite the dominance of English due to its widespread use and acceptance worldwide, the inner circle language variants of English still seem to hold dominance in ELT literature and materials. Is this a bad thing? Well, the optimists believe that the world has opted for English and the world knows what it wants, what will satisfy its needs, according to Hindmarsh 1978. Furthermore, Brash Khatru believes we should just move on and consider it as a positive development in the 20th century world context. And finally, Pennycook believes the spread of English is natural, neutral, and beneficial. It is natural because despite colonial opposition, its subsequent expansion is seen as a result of inevitable global forces. It's neutral because English has become detached from its original cultural heritage, i.e. the United States and the United Kingdom. And it's beneficial since international communication assumes that this occurs on a cooperative and equitable footing. So knowing this, should we maintain a central standard of English, or should the English variations be acknowledged as legitimate in their own right? And this brings about the clashes between two ideologies. First, Brash Khatru in 1985 suggests that native speakers seem to have given up on controlling its standardization. And Quirk in 1985 suggests that the existence of standards is an endemic feature, and people feel alienated and disoriented if a standard seems to be missing, thus suggesting the dependency on and the need for language authority. Regardless of this position, Pennycook discusses the concept of worldliness in English, where he holds that English can never be removed from the social, cultural, economic, or political context in which it is used. Furthermore, in his book, Pennycook discusses the intentionality of the dominance of the English language and how it is the culprit of linguistic genocide. He and other scholars claim that it negatively influences ELT around the globe, as it possesses a threat to indigenous languages, and it also assumes the role of a gatekeeper to better jobs in many societies. And what about the effect of the spread of English internationally? I have discussed how Pennycook describes the effect of the spread of English within a country, but the international spectrum is alas not immune. Specifically, because it has a role of being a gatekeeper for movement between countries, especially for refugees seeking a better future in English-speaking countries. The lack of English proficiency becomes a reason for discrimination, according to Tollefson, 1988, who believes this disadvantage will render them uncompetitive and therefore forcing them to compete for minimum wage employment. How might the teaching of English be considered an aspect of linguistic imperialism? Well, both linguistic imperialism and the worldliness of English have continued to hold all the aces by creating a dependency on inner circle languages. Whether for work or study, English is seen as a necessary hurdle over which you must jump in order to be successful.
Mahatma Gandhi was one of the most influenced people who lived in the 20th century. He lived in India, one of the countries that was part of the British Empire, and this is what he had to say about English. To give millions the knowledge of English is to enslave them. It is worth not noting that by receiving English education, we have enslaved the nation. The medium of a foreign language through which higher education has been imparted in India has caused incalculable intellectual and moral injury to the nation. So as part of the historical examples of the linguistic imperialism, we have to say that there have been, in the past, some of them. In the Roman Empire, the language from century 1 to 4 was the dominant language. The Arabic language was the dominant language in century 8 to 4 in Europe. And the Japanese language from the 18th century to the 20th century dominated Asia. So after World War II, English started the English globalization. So in that case, we have to say something about linguistic imperialism, who was Robert Phillipson, the one who pointed in 1992, who argued that a form of linguistic imperialism, a language, is a language domination. And then English is a native language in countries that have English as a native language benefited from a globalized English as a lingua franca nowadays. Now, Spolsky in 2004 says that English is nowadays a globally organized form of linguicism. But what's on the other side? What's on the other hand? Countries need to communicate, exchange, and socialize. That's part of the natural dynamics of the world, and countries are always looking for economic growth, technological progress, and quality of life improvement. So what will break the barrier of communication and create bonds of interculturality and economic growth? Well, David Crystal in 2003 says, well, a language in common will do that. So that is very clear for him that was English. So how might English be taught without linguistic imperialism? Well, Morian says in 2001 that English can be taught without the acculturalization. How can we do this? Well, there are 5 steps probably, that by decentralizing the English language teaching, by showing the English pluricentricity, that there are lots of standards of English, and also by considering that English has a lot of variations, and teaching those variations has an advantage by providing equivalences of those expressions. And in that, if we could go to the communication as an international level per se, there will be English as an international language, and then English as a lingua franca, as a variation of English as an international language. So English in the global education context, according to Moriano, he would say just that the teaching and learning of a geographically, politically, and culturally neutral form of English is perceived as the language of a wider communication and not as the possession of native speakers, to neutralize the negative impact on the cultural integrity of the learners. Thus, English as an international language is simply a utilitarian communicative tool one which allows a non-native user to retain, to the greatest degree possible, their distinctive cultural characteristic.